Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our series at MedTech for Maddie regarding FDA's new software guidance. I'm Maria Letcher, Senior Consultant with Fane Consulting.
And I'm Ryan Severson, Senior Consultant for Fane Consulting.
So Ryan, you know how much I love sports and I love hockey. And I was thinking back on one of my favorite podcasts called The Steam Room with Wayne Gretzky. And one of the hosts says in that podcast, how do you know when your podcast has gone from ordinary to great?
And the response to that question was, when the great one arrives.
I knew, Ryan, that you would know the answer to that. When the great one arrives.
But poor Madeline, as much as we'd like to see her sit here for the entire podcast with us, she is a very busy CEO and has prior engagements that she needs to attend to. All right, so what we're talking about today is the way that the new FDA software guidance incorporates the consideration of risk into the total software development lifecycle. So Marielle, what are the differences between the new and the old?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, there are a few key takeaways we should consider. So the 2021 guidance doesn't really wholly deviate from the 2005 guidance, the new versus the old, but rather it provides more clarifying detail. And in some ways, it simplifies the requirements, and in some ways, it makes them a little bit more extensive. So mainly the documentation that must be submitted to the FDA as part of the pre-market submission has changed. Again, it's increased in some respects, decreased in others. For instance, alignment with IEC 62304 is now required, whereas before it wasn't, as we know, necessarily required. Secondly, the documentation categories are simplified and clarified under the new guidance, Ryan, where the requirements themselves are a little bit more extensive, especially for those low-risk devices, which I think we'll hear from you in a few minutes, kind of how that may be true. Finally, the level of concern, or LOC as we'll call it in this discussion, it was always kind of at odds with the software level of risk. So we had that level of risk, A, B, and C, as described in some of the international standards, like ANSI and IEC 62304, and it sometimes just kind of was or wasn't used by FDA beyond inclusion in the submission. So Ryan, FDA's categorization of software under the old 2005 guidance was a little bit complicated, I thought, for people to understand. There were 3 levels. Maybe you could explain for our audience a little bit more about those 3 levels.
Sure. Under the old guidance, the level of concern was considered major if a failure or latent design flaw could, asterisk word, could,
yes.
Could conceivably cause the death or serious injury of the patient or user, and that's directly or indirectly. Yeah. Similarly, moderate level of concern would be if a failure or latent design flaw could conceively cause a minor injury to the patient or user, and that's again directly or indirectly. And then a minor is if failure or latent flaw were unlikely to cause any type of injury to the patient or user. Now, it was a complicated process. It put the onus on making that judgment call on industry, and it's an intrinsically flawed system. Mario, what were some of the flaws with that system?
Well, you kind of pointed it out earlier when you mentioned the word could, Ryan. So the use of the word could under the old guidance when we talk about these different categories of risk focused really only on severity of injury and didn't really take into account the probability of that injury actually occurring. So what this resulted in was these occasions where there were a lot of hypotheticals that, death or serious injury may or may not occur in this really rare software scenario or with this rare anomaly or bug. And that was really where I think there was a big flaw, because there was an equally similar emphasis with minor level of risk. I mean, FDA didn't really take into a lot of consideration minor level of risk. In fact, sometimes we even wondered if those were in fact devices. So if death or serious injury or minor injury was unlikely to ever occur, well then is it even a device? And so a lot of that ambiguity is addressed by changing the classification of software into 2 categories that I think are much easier to follow and much easier to understand. So for instance, the new guidance replaces this old level of concern thinking and analysis with a new documentation level analysis that simplifies these categories. And maybe you can describe for us how they're simplified and what those two categories now are.
Sure. The first category under the new guidance is the enhanced documentation. And, you know, this documentation should be provided for any submission or any change that includes a device software function where the failure leads to a hazardous situation that is probable to cause death or serious injury to a patient. Now, probable is another asterisk word, so remember that. We'll be talking about that a little later. And kind of the idea is that the risk is going to, what they're kind of getting at is that risk should be considered all the way through the development process prior to the implementation of any risk control measures. And this is just a way to incorporate it early and often as you're going through your development process. And the second category is the basic documentation. And the basic documentation is to include software function for which the enhanced documentation doesn't apply. So that's kind of the big bucket that everything else falls into. So now, what does industry need to know based on these new classifications? You know, what are the key takeaways?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. There are a few, I think, takeaways we can consider. So you mentioned one of them a few moments ago when you mentioned the word probable.
Mm-hmm.
That's a word that the FDA actually asterisks in this guidance. And what they're really referring back to is those purely hypothetical risks that could occur, that really are unlikely to happen, unlikely to occur. And by using this new approach, the vast majority of submissions to the FDA for software, and including software, will land into the basic level and will not be into the enhanced level. And so we're going to talk about what that kind of looks like. The critical component of software design is really the emphasis on the new approach. So change management, risk management was not really required under the old guidance, and now it is under what we call requiring software architecture for all the software as a medical device, software in a medical device for pre-market submissions. And it's a much more extensive guidance for the contents of software architecture. So that's one of the key differences. The major difference is, another major difference is the level of detail expected for some of these deliverables. So for some levels of risk, it's lower. So for instance, a moderate level under the old guidance would actually fall into basic under the new approach. And so for a moderate level of risk device, you'd actually require less under the new. But for low risk devices, it's actually raised the bar. So the old guidance also only required a hazard analysis, and now you have to submit the complete risk management file. That's true for all classes of devices. So I think we've touched on a few of those key takeaways. Ryan, did I miss anything?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, that brings us to our next question that I would love to ask you, which is how does the level of concern versus the documentation level, so kind of what we were just talking about, how does that change the way risk is considered?
Well, from a very high level, just looking at both guidances, the old versus the new, the word risk was mentioned 19 times in the old guidance, and most of those were in the section that kind of identified the contents of the risk management file. In fact, I think over half of them. You want to take a guess at how many times risk is mentioned in the new guidance?
Is it over 100 or under 100?
It's over.
I would have guessed 85, Ryan. I'm surprised to hear it's over 100.
No, it's over 100. It was mentioned 174 times in the new guidance.
174 versus 19. That's a big difference.
That is a huge difference. Not only does the new guidance do a much better job of giving a specific list of items needed in that risk management file, but it also does a much better job of giving the wheres and whys and the hows as to how risk should be implemented as a part of the larger development and maintenance plan. Just as an example, the new guidance does a fantastic job of identifying which specific submission documents should have risk considerations built in right from the start. The list here, directly from the guidance, if you will allow me to read, is the document level justification, system requirements document, configuration management plan and maintenance documents, software verification and validation. And the list goes on and on. It's a much more detailed and specific guidance that only states where a risk needs to be considered, but it also establishes the kind of the everything through the risk assessment paradigm that aligns more closely with GMP and with ISO 14971. Kind of to expand on that a little bit further, we'll take the example of like unresolved software anomalies.
Oh, that's always a good one, Ryan.
It's one of my personal favorites. But one of the items required within the guidance is a risk-based rationale for not correcting or fixing the anomaly in alignment with the sponsor's risk management plan or procedures. So it isn't just looking at a risk assessment and addressing a risk case that exists in there, but more of a global view of your entire risk management plan. So what are the next steps for industry? We've got this shiny new guidance, and industry eventually is going to be expected to follow it. So what are the next steps for industry right now?
Good question, because I think that this software guidance is a little bit complicated, so I think that industry is probably sitting there saying, what do we do next? And the first thing that I would recommend to ensure a seamless transition is to conduct a gap analysis. Take a look at at the old guidance versus the new guidance and understand how your quality management system is aligned, and make sure that all of your key stakeholders are trained. The next thing I would do, and this touches on what you were just discussing, Ryan, is conduct an updated risk analysis. Update the risk management plan, update the risk management report, have some of those risk conversations within your company. And finally, the third thing that I would say needs to be done is look at the resources that you have on your staff. And do you have what it takes to make all these changes? And if not, nobody likes to struggle through this, and we certainly don't want you to struggle with this. So we encourage you to reach out to us if you need regulatory assistance with this new guidance or anything else at www.fangconsulting.com for any regulatory needs that you may have. Please join us for part 3 of our series next week, which will be about the verification and validation activities required under the new guidance for software as a device function. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mario Letcher, Fang Consulting.
And I'm Ryan Severson, Fang Consulting. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.